There were leggings that had been made from the skin of a woman's legs.
Hey people, so today we're going to be talking about a serial killer called Ed Gein. Sometimes people pronounce his name Gein, but it's a German name, so it is actually Gein. His full name is Edward Theodore Gein, most commonly known as Ed though. You'll probably know him through different films. So he's been the inspiration for Psycho, for Silence of the Lambs, for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for some of the characters in Devil's Rejects, a bunch of films, and there's also loads of documentaries about him. There's quite a few books written about him. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it. Before I start, I just want to say that some of the photos that I'm going to be showing probably aren't for people with weak stomachs. So they're pretty disturbing. Yeah, they're not pleasant to look at. So just a warning, if you're one of those people, I would leave. Okay, let's begin. Edward Theodore Gein was born in 1906. People knew him mostly as Ed. Some people that were close to the family would call him Eddie, or some of the townspeople where he lived. He was born to his father called George and his mother Augusta. He also had an older brother who was 5 years older than him, and his name was Henry. So there was lots and lots of problems in the family home of Ed Gein. His parents did not get on at all. They actually fought incessantly, and there was lots of physical abuse, there was emotional abuse. His mother really despised his father. She actually viewed him as completely worthless. He was also an alcoholic. So George, Ed's father, worked as a carpenter, sometimes as a farmer, and various other odd jobs. Augusta ran a successful grocery business, so that's more or less what supported the family through. She was also ridiculously religious, like to the extreme. So she would often inflict these ideologies and beliefs on the two boys, Ed and Henry. She also didn't allow George to really partake in the son's upbringing, bar beatings that he would give them. But that's really the height of it. Other than that, he would usually just be drunk. And in 1914, they moved to a place in Plainfield in Wisconsin. It was a huge farm. It was 195 acres. And they moved out to this more or less remote farm because Augusta wanted to be away from civilization, more or less. She did not want to be around people. Augusta actually viewed all of civilization as sinners. So she thought if they were on this farm, with just vast fields and land all around them, that no one could influence her or her boys. And that's really all she cared about. She wanted to have control over those boys and what they thought, what they did, everything. And this was almost the perfect place.
The Gein family settled onto a 200-acre farm in Plainfield. Isolated, the family dynamic grew stranger and stranger.
Mr. Gein had a very strange relationship with his mother. It was a love-hate relationship. He listened to her and worshipped her and followed her very closely.
She was a religiously devout, if not fanatical woman. Very domineering, very strong-willed. I mean, she completely dominated her husband as well, Henry.
Augusta would preach a lot out of the book of Revelations that said that women were whores, women were tramps.
There's a few things that happened in Ed's life I think most people would consider abnormal. And the first one I could find was when he was 7. It happened around the back of Augusta's grocery store. And Augusta and George, that's Ed's parents, were slaughtering a pig. Now, Ed had seen this, and his response to this was that he had an orgasm. And I think most people would agree that that's really weird and very abnormal. And I think it would make most people feel pretty uncomfortable that someone had had that response to a living thing slaughtered in front of them, being in pain, suffering, that his response was to have an orgasm. Strange. Another important point in Ed's life was his school life. So he went to school. He actually did quite well at reading. He actually surpassed the other pupils in reading, but he didn't really have any friends. He was very shy, and he actually got bullied quite a bit for this. Now, if he went home and told his father that he was getting bullied or he was upset and he would cry, His father's response was to beat him so badly that his ears would ring. And his mother's response was verbal abuse.
And when he finished school at approximately 7th grade, he just went home then and worked on the farm there. So he did not have contact with the outside world, shall we say, to any extent.
So it's pretty evident that from an early age, Ed had suffered quite a lot of various different types of abuse, physical, emotional, mental. I couldn't find any reference to sexual abuse anywhere. But it seemed to be that he grew up in quite a horrific environment. There was no affection, no caring, no love. It just seemed to be all very much control and suffering for him. Another point that I thought was kind of disturbing for Ed was when he was 12. His mother actually caught him in the bathtub masturbating, and her response to this was to grab his penis and call that area the curse of man. Now, for a 12-year-old, you can imagine that's going to be pretty traumatizing. You're not really going to understand why she's doing that. So it was evident that very early on, Ed's sexuality was completely shamed by his mother. And for a 12-year-old, that's incredibly difficult to understand. It's going to 100% skew his views on sexuality and relationships, on himself. The next main point regarding his sexuality happened when he was 21, and that's when his mother made Henry and Ed both promise to remain virgins for the rest of their lives. So it's becoming pretty clear that Augusta was really heavily focused on sexuality and stopping it happening in her boys. So it's probably a good time to speak about her viewpoints and what she thought of men and what she thought of women. Augusta hated all women, and equally she hated all men. She thought that all men were useless, they were all failures. She thought that all women were harlots, they were all living in sin. She disliked everyone and everything. Under no circumstances did she want her sons to get married, to be with women. She wanted none of that. There's actually an incident that I'll talk about a little later in the storyline with Augusta and her reaction to a woman that is, it's just so extreme. It will give you a better taste as to how just fanatically religious she actually was. Although she thought all other women were sinful, they were harlots, they were no good, that she obviously was exempt from this herself. So when Ed was 34, his father actually died. His father died of pneumonic fluid on the lungs. He was 66 when he died. The family were actually somewhat relieved that he died. As I said earlier, the parents had such a horrible, horrible relationship, and the mother would often speak about George, her husband, burning in hell after he died. Lovely woman. So it was also around this time that Ed and his brother would do little jobs, odd jobs around the town in Plainfield, because the farm, I guess it was quite hard to get a solid income from that. So they had to do other odd jobs. One of the jobs that Ed used to do was babysitting the local children. So he was actually really well liked by the locals. They thought he was quite sweet. They didn't think that he would ever be capable of the crimes that he did. So he would often be left with them alone, which is pretty insane when you think about the stuff that he did and how those parents must have felt when they found out what he had been doing and what he had been keeping in his house, that he had been alone with their children.
How long have you known Mr. 7 years? What kind of a man did you know him as? Well, a man, he's a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little hot.
It was around this time that Ed's brother Henry started to question their mother, and Ed did not like it. Henry actually believed that Ed had an unhealthy attachment to her, and Henry also didn't agree with how she inflicted her religious beliefs and ideologies on the boys. Ed was actually really taken aback by this, and he was quite shocked. He didn't really know what to say or what to do. His mother was his best friend and essentially his one true love, so he took this very personally. Shortly after this, Henry mysteriously died in a fire. So there's quite a lot of controversy around this because of the way Henry was found. Ed reported that he wasn't able to find Henry, but he had somehow perished in this massive fire that was on the farm. Now, Ed claimed that he didn't know exactly where Henry was, he just knew that he had somehow perished in this fire. Except, he was able to lead police straight to his body. And also, Henry had no burns on his body. He actually had some injuries to his head. So this was very, very suspicious. However, police didn't really see it like that. They just thought that, oh, maybe Henry had fallen, maybe he bumped his head and he died from inhalation of smoke. So the coroner actually reported that Henry died from asphyxiation. I'm not really sure how police overlooked all of these things. I think maybe there was the kind of belief that their father had recently died and now their son had died, so they just thought, oh, these are horrible circumstances, let's just leave the family be, let's leave them in peace. Now for Ed, this was exactly what he wanted. He had his mother to himself and he loved that. His mother also loved this too. She had her favourite son. The police also actually didn't believe Ed would be capable of murdering Henry or of any sort of foul play. So I think that just goes to show what the townspeople thought of Ed's character.
Ed and Mother were now alone, but their union would be short-lived. Just months after burying her son Henry, Augusta suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed.
So shortly after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a stroke. I'm not sure if this was due to the stress of Henry or if it was for unknown reasons, but it happened very shortly after this. She became quite ill after, and Ed actually had to nurse her back to health. It was around this time that Ed also became really interested in reading about some obscure things like grave digging, amputations, all that sort of good stuff. So his mother, as extreme as she was, actually was getting a little bit worried about Ed at this point. But that was to be short-lived, because his mother actually had a second stroke and died. She died at age 67, and I think there was about a year in between her first stroke and her second stroke. And interestingly enough, the thing that triggered her second stroke was to do with a woman, the thing that I mentioned earlier that I would talk about. So the story behind it was that Ed and his mother, Augusta, had called to a nearby farm, and the farmer was actually beating the dog that he owned to death. I'm not really sure why this was. I couldn't find information on that. I mean, I guess it was a different time, so maybe that sort of thing was horribly accepted. I'm not sure. But that wasn't the reason why Augusta got upset. The reason why she got upset was because when this family friend or neighbor was beating the dog, a woman actually came out of the house, and this was the partner of this man who was beating the dog, except they weren't married. So this is what triggered Augusta. She started screaming, she was uncontrollable, she was calling the woman a harlot. They weren't married, so she just could not deal with this. Ed actually had to bring her home. He had to leave there with her because she was just so irate. And this is what's theorized to have brought upon her second stroke.
His mother had completely undermined his manhood in every way. And at her funeral, he was reacting like a little schoolboy who had just lost his mommy, and just crying hysterically.
As you can imagine, Ed was absolutely distraught that his mother had died. This was the only person he had in the entire world. She was gone. His best friend, his only source of real communication, as he wasn't allowed to have friends all throughout his life. If he dared to try to make one, she would beat him for it. She would shame him for it. So essentially all he had was her, and now she was gone. Ed's response to his mother's death was to actually board up her bedroom to preserve it perfectly the way it was when she died. This is when some of the townspeople also started to notice that Ed's physical appearance started to get quite worse. He just looked really haggard, he looked dirty, his clothes weren't washed, and people would say a strange smell was coming from the house. And then Ed went one step further and actually boarded up all of the doors in the house bar 2 rooms. So the rooms you see now are in a really terrible state, and this is how Ed lived. It's now when his insanity or psychosis, whatever mental deterioration, I think really started to kick off. Ed was 41 when he dug up his first corpse. He had actually been frequenting the graveyard quite often to visit the grave of his mother, and it was said that he had gotten visions while he was at the graveyard, some of them of his mother, some of them of digging up corpses. And that's what he did. And the first corpse he dug up was his mother. He actually twisted her head off with his bare hands and brought it home to see if he could shrink it, because that's what he read in some of these books that he'd been reading, that ironically his mother was worried about him reading. Over the course of the next 4 or so years, Ed began to dig up other corpses. Police estimate that this was about 9. So Ed would often look at the obituaries, see who had recently died, and dig them up. It was always women. Ed claims that he never had sex with any of these corpses, and actually went as far as to say he never had a sexual experience in his life, bar masturbation. And although he didn't actually have any sexual interactions with the corpses, it still all falls under the category of necrophilia. And it was around this time that police started to notice there was some people going missing in the area. So although all the corpses he dug up were female, police suspect that he may be involved in the disappearance of 2 men. But it's not certain, it's just conjecture on the police's part. These men were Victor Travis and Ray Burgess. They also suspect Ed of killing Evelyn Hartley, who was a 15-year-old teenager, and she was actually kidnapped while she was babysitting. So during this time when these people were going missing, people still weren't suspecting Ed at the time. This only happened afterwards when they had found what they found at his house. Around this time, no one yet suspected Ed, and he was actually developing a fascination or an obsession for a woman who owned a pub in the town. Her name was Mary Hogan, and she actually looked quite like Augusta, Ed's mother, except personality-wise they were completely different, and this kind of weirdly attracted Ed to her. I think he thought that the stark contrast was almost appealing in a strange type of way. On December 8, 1954, when Ed was 48, the pub owner, Mary Hogan, disappeared. The police immediately suspected foul play because there was blood on the floor and there was an empty shell casing. What police didn't know was that Ed had shot her. When Ed was arrested for this murder, he'd actually revealed that he'd been hanging out with her before this and drinking, which I imagine lulled her into a false sense of security. And I mean, the townspeople thought that Ed was a really decent guy. Like I said, he would mind their children. He was their babysitter. So why wouldn't she hang out with him and have a drink? Why wouldn't she trust him? The day after this murder, Ed actually told someone that he did it. He told someone he was working with called Elmo, except Elmo just dismissed this because, again, no one believed that Ed would do something like that. He thought he was just joking around. A couple of years after Mary Hogan went missing, another woman went missing in the town. So this woman owned a hardware store, and her name was Bernice Warden. She was a 58-year-old woman, and she worked in the shop most days. All the townspeople knew her. She was a really nice woman, and people were shocked when she had went missing.
And so the main street would be a quiet place.
Particularly quiet that morning was Bernice Warden's hardware store. Though the store was supposed to be open, the 58-year-old proprietor was nowhere to be found.
I lived across the street from the hardware store where Bernice Warden ran her business. I believe it was in the afternoon. People were starting to wonder why the store was locked and where was Bernice Warden.
So her son came back from deer hunting himself and found that the place was a mess. There was blood all over the floor, and they started to investigate what might have possibly happened to her.
Interviewed by police, Bernice Warden's son mentioned a frequent customer who'd been in just the day before to check on the price of antifreeze. Ed Gein.
When police called to her hardware store to investigate the disappearance, they found some interesting things. They found some blood on the floor, they found a rifle placed back where it shouldn't have been, and they also found a receipt made out to Ed, which kind of gave him away. The receipt said that basically Ed had been in the day before and he'd bought antifreeze. So this was the police's lead. On November 17th, 1957, when Ed was 51, police went into his house. In his house, they found Bernice Worden, except she was headless, and she was found hanging upside down with her ankles lashed out to a wooden cross beam. She had actually been cut from her vagina to her sternum, basically like you would hang up wild animals after hunting, as if you would hang up a deer or a pig or a cow. That's how this woman was. Police also found various disturbing things. In the house, police found 4 noses, whole human bones and fragments, 9 masks made of human skin, bowls from human skulls, 10 female heads with the tops sawed off, human skin covering several chair seats, Mary Hogan's, that's the pub owner, her head in a paper bag, Bernice Worden, the hardware store owner, they found her head in a burlap sack, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, skulls on his bedposts, organs in the refrigerator, a belt made out of women's nipples, and a lampshade made from the skin of a woman's face. Ed was immediately arrested, and the next day his questioning began. He at first remained silent and actually didn't admit to anything. But eventually he confessed to the murder of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. It was found that Bernice Worden, the hardware owner who was found hanging up in his house, actually died of a gunshot wound to the head. I really hope and take solace in the fact that she had been killed before any of the injuries that were sustained to her happened. A couple of days later, Ed had to do a lie detector test. Now, from this test, it was found that he had killed the 15-year-old babysitter, Evelyn Hartley. However, lie detector tests aren't admissible in court, so he was never technically charged for this. Ed's trial began on the 22nd of November 1957. There was various professionals that actually thought Ed was a sexual psychopath and a schizophrenic. In December, Ed was interviewed by a doctor called Dr. Schubert. He had actually found that Ed had an abnormally magnified attachment to his mother. During this trial period, various graves were dug up to see basically if the bodies were still in there, if Ed had actually been digging up these bodies. The graves of these people were found empty. Police also found various different bones on Ed's farm buried. One of them was a skull, believed to be a male skull. This could possibly be linked with the 2 males mentioned earlier that went missing that Ed was suspected in. During the trial, Ed was found to be clinically insane and he was committed to the Central State Hospital. Now, it was about 10 years later that he was actually then deemed sane, and they retried him again. During the second trial, Ed was found guilty of the first-degree murder for the shooting of Bernice Worden, the woman that was found hanging in his house, but the court also found on the same day that he again was not sane. So they basically concluded that he was not guilty due to reason of insanity. He then returned back to the Central State Hospital, and in 1974, in February, when Ed was 68, he actually filed a petition to basically say he had recovered and his mental health was all good, he was fully competent, and there was no reason why he should be in the hospital anymore. Ed, come on. When Ed was 72, he was actually moved to a different institution, and this one was called the Mendota Mental Institute. Staff here would actually say that Ed was really helpful, he had really good manners, he was quite mild in terms of behavior, he was just all around a pretty good patient.
At Central State Hospital, staffers soon came to view Ed Gein as something of a model patient.
Ed was a quiet individual. He'd go and sit in the corner in the day room, and we had some nice lounge chairs out there, and he'd read the paper there. He wouldn't converse too much with other patients. I can remember we used to play cribbage together out in the day room.
There were, however, times when Gein behaved oddly.
When it got, say, full moon, he would talk about women, what he'd like to do to them, and just ramble on and on. Just like very incoherent. And then as the full moon dissipated, he would get more back to normal. But he always had that glint in his eye that you kind of figured there was something there that was wrong.
It was in the Mendota Mental Institute where Ed passed away. On the 27th of July 1984, Ed was laid to rest beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery with only 4 people in attendance. In total, there is believed to be 7 victims of Ed, 2 that he's confessed to and 5 suspected, the 2 being the 2 women that we spoke of, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed the disturbing, horrible, creepy grossness of this story. And I hope to see you guys in the next one. Bye. I've also just realized that there is kind of Teletubby sun vibes happening here. How have I not noticed this?